It facilitates calcium absorption through the small intestines. So if you don't have vitamin D, you can take all the calcium supplements you want, but you're not going to get much absorption. It'll just go right through the GI tract. And so that's why they're starting to put vitamin D with calcium, but they're putting about 400 international units in. And if a person's really vitamin D deficient, that may not be enough. So you need a level checked so that we know. Vitamin D stimulates insulin secretion. It retards insulin resistance. You know, James was here talking about the adult onset diabetic who has insulin resistance and later will develop problem with insulin release. It is anti-cancer, vitamin D. And this is something we're just discovering. People that are deficient in vitamin D will be at much greater risk for all kinds of cancers. It is immune modulating. That means that unless we have adequate stores of vitamin D, the immune system will be hypofunctioning. It will be out of normal functioning, allowing individuals to get infections more easily, viral infections, bacterial infections. In fact, the body actually produces its own antimicrobial agent. The one that we've at least identified up to this point is cathelicidin, which is an agent. It's not important that you write, all that, but just know that the body produces certain compounds that act like antibiotics and antiviral agents if it is getting sun. This is why one of the challenges we have is that in people who develop infectious diseases, let's say like TB, do you remember how we used to treat TB? Got them out in the sun. Yeah, exactly. Put them out in the sun. And that was the old TB sanitariums. And this is why it may be that the darker pigmented populations are much more susceptible to tuberculosis and these other infectious diseases and certain cancers. And when they get them, they're much harder to treat, you see, because the body isn't getting what it needs to help its innate immune system to combat these things. Vitamin D enhances muscle mass and muscle strength. A lot of people say, I just don't feel like I've got much strength. I just feel weak. And they don't recognize, they go to the doctor, they check their blood work, everything looks okay, CBC, chemistry panels, everything's okay. And they say, I just don't have any strength. But nobody thinks to check a vitamin D level. Okay. We now know that vitamin D, since it affects muscle strength, may actually be associated, vitamin D deficiency, with heart failure, because the heart muscle strength of contraction is impaired. How prevalent is it? Well, let's just look at levels. Normally, if you take your chemistry panel, they'll have a recommended range. It used to be, in fact still is in some labs, 20 to 100. Well, that's changing a little bit, and now we're seeing at least 30 to 32 to 100 is a safer range. And as we're studying it more, from the data of disease in relationship to vitamin D, like fractures, osteoporosis, you will see not a trailing of that rise in disease until you get up to levels of about 40, okay, of vitamin D. But let's just look at levels. Experts have earlier defined severe vitamin D deficiency at being like less than 20, 10 to 20. And yet, you'll activate your parathyroid glands when levels probably fall below about 30 to 40. Now, the parathyroid glands sense calcium levels in the blood. So if you're, for instance, if you're vitamin D deficient, you can't absorb calcium even though there's plenty of calcium in food. You can't absorb it. So levels begin to drop. The body senses that. The parathyroid glands begin to activate, and they will then act through parathormone on the bones to remove calcium from the bones to put it in the bloodstream. Okay? And then over a period of time, the bones become weakened, osteopenia, osteoporosis, and bad enough, osteomalacia, where you start having pain. Okay? So you can see that this is a difficult disease process that affects so many organ systems. Okay? And the prevalence is interesting. Given, let's say, levels of 21 to 29, that is considered relative insufficiency. In other words, below 20, definite deficiency. 21 to 29, relative insufficiency. Above 30, lower limits of normal. Ideal, probably somewhere in the 40 to 70 range. Levels higher than 150, usually intoxication, and that's when you get into all the high levels of supplementation that people, I mean, you're not going to get anywhere near 150 getting out in the sun because the body will regulate that. You can't get too much vitamin D by sun exposure. You can burn yourself, but you won't get too much vitamin D, okay? It's estimated now, by using these definitions of levels, that 1 billion people worldwide have either deficiency or inadequacy of vitamin D. By different studies that are now in the literature, 40 to 100%, depending upon what study you read, about half to almost all, the majority, have of U.S. and European elderly men and women living in not nursing homes but community residences are deficient in vitamin D. That's a lot of people. Okay? No. Well, we don't know, at least at this point. We haven't found a storage site other than, well, no, that's for calcium. No. But there's a fine regulatory system that's set up in the body because, you know, the 125 dihydroxy vitamin D that's produced once it goes through the kidney, it has a negative feedback. Once it gets up to a certain level, it will stop that production. So it's not going to get to a toxic level unless you're giving too much vitamin D. We'll get into that. Okay. It's estimated that more than half of postmenopausal women that are even taking medication now for osteoporosis, when they were studied, they had suboptimal levels, below 30 of vitamin D. 50%. You know, their own Fosamax, Actonel, all of these, but no one checked to see about their vitamin D levels. Okay, they just, osteoporosis, here's your pill. 52% of Hispanic and Black adolescents in a study in Boston, and 48% of white pre-adolescent girls in Maine had 25-hydroxy levels less than 20 when they were studied. And now here's an interesting one for, physician, heal thyself. In a study in one of the Boston hospitals, 32% of healthy students, physicians, and residents at a Boston hospital were found to be vitamin D deficient, despite their drinking a glass of milk and taking a multivitamin daily and eating salmon at least once a week. So you see, God doesn't want us just to have to rely on pills. He wants us to get what He has asked. Now, this is interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but even in these countries, when you get over to Turkey, India, the United Arab Emirates, states, Saudi Arabia, now those people would get plenty of sun, you would think, right? They're all covered up, okay? And they found that in these countries, as they did studies of children and adolescents, up to 50% of them still had vitamin D levels less than 20. Who's behind all this? The enemy. Okay, you remember, I have come that they may have life, and life abundantly. And you can see that our artificial living is after the order of this world. And who is the prince of this world? It's not the Lord, is it? Okay. And we've been deluded. He has tried to rob us of those very things that we need to enjoy a life that God has given us. Now, I'm just going to mention a few things here. Diseases that are associated with deficiencies of vitamin D that we know about. We talked about cardiovascular disease, heart failure, diabetes, cancers of several organ systems, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, these autoimmune disorders, scleroderma, celiac disease, asthma, psoriasis, osteoporosis, osteopenia, prostate cancer, multiple sclerosis, osteoarthritis. I mean, just on and on and on. So, we need to head this off, don't we? I'm going to, for the sake of time, I just want to mention this. When you are one of your family members, are a friend, are someone you're working with as you're now learning how to do medical missionary work, right? You come in contact with people. You should put vitamin D in your differential list in any person who is complaining of diffuse musculoskeletal pain or weakness, who has been given a diagnosis of fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, patients who have on their DEXA scan osteopenia or osteoporosis, those in the elderly who have simply stumbled and developed a fracture, a fracture. Think of vitamin D deficiency. And now, also, with all these other diseases, we need to expand our understanding, those patients with cancer, with autoimmune disorders, diabetes, heart disease, the whole gamut. These patients need to be screened for vitamin D deficiency. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the only cause. Too much animal fats will clog up the arteries, right? You've been studying that in cholesterol. But you see, there are multiple factors that impinge upon disease. It's not just one. The risk factors for coronary artery disease, obesity, hypertension, animal fats, cholesterol, stress, heredity. There are multiple things that are are pressing